The autumn sun cast long shadows through the towering windows of the Cook County Courthouse as Sarah Johnson made her way through security. The metal detector beeped softly as she passed through, her patent leather heels clicking against the polished marble floor. At 35, Sarah had already made partner at one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, but today she wasn't here as an attorney. She was answering the call for jury duty. The morning air inside the courthouse carried the familiar scent of wood polish and paper, mingling with the subtle perfume of coffee from paper cups clutched by nervous defendants and hurried lawyers. Sarah adjusted her charcoal gray suit, a power outfit she'd chosen deliberately. Experience had taught her that as a black woman in professional spaces, appearance mattered more than it should. The jury assembly room buzzed with the low murmur of conversations and rustling papers. Some potential jurors slouched in their seats, clearly hoping to be dismissed, while others sat rigid with anxiety. Sarah took a seat near the front, pulling out her tablet to review some work emails while she waited. A young law clerk did a double take as she walked past, clearly surprised to see someone so well-dressed in the jury pool. As the court officer began calling names, Sarah observed her fellow potential jurors. There was a retired schoolteacher with silver hair who kept checking her watch, a construction worker in clean but worn jeans who was reading a paperback novel, and a young graduate student frantically typing on her laptop. The diversity, or lack thereof, in the room didn't escape Sarah's notice. When the voir dire process began, Sarah answered each question with the measured precision that had served her well in corporate boardrooms. Yes, she could be impartial. Yes, she understood the burden of proof. No, she had no prior connections to the case. She watched as the attorney's eyes lit up at her responses, recognizing a potential juror who understood legal proceedings. The defense attorney tried 3 times to dismiss her, perhaps sensing that her sharp mind and legal background might work against his client. But the prosecution fought to keep her, and in the end, Sarah found herself selected not just as a juror, but as the jury forewoman. As she took her place in the jury box, she couldn't help but notice she was the only person of color among the 12 selected jurors. Little did anyone in that courtroom know that what started as a routine jury selection would soon expose the deep-seated biases still lurking within the justice system, and Sarah Johnson's morning would become the catalyst for a story that would ripple through Chicago's legal community. The selection process continued as morning light filled the courtroom. Sarah sat quietly, watching the careful dance between prosecution and defense attorneys as they questioned each potential juror. She noticed how the defense attorney, Mr. Peterson, kept glancing her way with barely concealed concern. His perfectly pressed suit and gleaming cufflinks couldn't hide his unease at having a black woman with legal knowledge on the jury. The case itself was high profile. A wealthy businessman accused of embezzling millions from employee pension funds. Sarah could practically feel the tension in the room as each question probed deeper into the potential jurors' backgrounds. When it was her turn to speak again, she chose her words carefully, drawing from years of courtroom experience without revealing too much about her legal career. "I believe I can evaluate the evidence fairly," she stated, maintaining steady eye contact with both attorneys. The prosecution's eyes lit up. They had recognized something in her demeanor that spoke of intelligence and fairness. But Mr. Peterson wasn't giving up easily. "Your Honor, I move to strike juror number 7 for cause," he announced for the 3rd time, his voice carrying a hint of desperation. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though inside she was counting the familiar patterns of bias she'd faced throughout her career. The judge denied the motion again, and Sarah could have sworn she saw a flicker of satisfaction cross the prosecutor's face. The selection process dragged on through lunch, with both sides using their peremptory challenges strategically. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as, one by one, potential jurors were dismissed or selected. Sarah watched as a diverse pool of candidates was gradually whittled down to a noticeably less diverse jury. When the final selection was made, Sarah found herself not just on the jury, but nominated as forewoman. The other jurors had quickly picked up on her quiet confidence and articulate responses. What none of them knew was that she had argued cases before the Supreme Court of Illinois, or that she had a corner office overlooking Lake Michigan. As the newly formed jury filed into their designated seats, Sarah caught fragments of whispered conversations around her. Some expressed surprise at the quick selection process, while others discussed their disrupted work schedules. She smiled inwardly, knowing that her presence on this jury was already challenging stereotypes, though the biggest test of prejudice was yet to come. The judge gave them their preliminary instructions, his voice droning on about impartiality and the burden of proof. Sarah listened intently, mentally preparing for the days ahead. Little did she know that her role in this trial would extend far beyond evaluating evidence. She was about to become part of a powerful lesson about prejudice and the justice system itself. On the third day of trial, Chicago's infamous public transit system decided to throw Sarah Johnson a curveball. The Red Line train screeched to a halt between stations, the conductor's voice crackling over the speaker about temporary technical difficulties. Sarah checked her watch. 8:45 a.m. Court started at 9 o'clock sharp, and she was still 20 minutes away. She tried to stay calm, but her heart raced as the minutes ticked by. The other passengers seemed equally frustrated. A mother trying to get her kids to school, businessmen checking their watches, and students clutching their backpacks. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train lurched forward. Sarah burst through the courthouse doors at 9:10 a.m., her usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from running up the courthouse steps. The security guard, Tom, who had come to know her over the past 2 days, gave her a sympathetic look as she rushed through the metal detector. "Judge Harrison's in rare form today," he whispered as she passed. The ancient elevator seemed to move in slow motion as it climbed to the 4th floor. Sarah could feel beads of sweat forming on her forehead, her designer blazer suddenly feeling too warm. She'd never been late to anything in her professional life, not to client meetings, not to court appearances, and certainly not to jury duty. The heavy wooden doors of courtroom 403 creaked loudly as she pushed them open, drawing every eye in the room. Judge William Harrison, known throughout Cook County for his rigid adherence to punctuality, stopped mid-sentence. His face, already stern, darkened as he observed Sarah, trying to quietly make her way to the jury box. The room fell into a thick, uncomfortable silence. The other jurors shifted nervously in their seats, and the court reporter's fingers hovered motionless over her stenograph. Even the defendant and his attorney seemed to hold their breath, sensing the brewing storm. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Judge Harrison's face as he looked down from his bench, his wire-rimmed glasses glinting. His assumption was immediate and obvious. Here was another person who didn't respect his courtroom, another person who didn't take their civic duty seriously. The fact that Sarah was black seemed to reinforce his prejudices, though he would never admit it. What happened next would become a teaching moment for everyone present, though not in the way Judge Harrison intended. The tension in the room was about to snap, and with it long-held biases would be exposed in the harsh light of justice. Judge Harrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "Young lady," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "do you have any idea what time it is?" He didn't wait for Sarah's response before continuing. "This is a court of law, not a social gathering. Your tardiness shows a complete disregard for this institution." Sarah stood perfectly still, her expression composed despite the public humiliation. Years of facing subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination had taught her to maintain her dignity, even in the face of unfair treatment. The other jurors watched uncomfortably as their fellow member became the target of the judge's wrath. "I've seen this far too often," Judge Harrison continued, his voice rising. "People thinking they can just stroll in whenever they please, treating jury duty like an optional appointment." His face had turned slightly red, the veins in his neck becoming visible. The court clerk avoided making eye contact with anyone, shuffling papers unnecessarily. The judge's assumption was clear to everyone in the room. He had taken one look at Sarah and made up his mind about who and what she was. The fact that she was dressed in a designer suit, carried a leather briefcase, and conducted herself with professional poise, seemed to escape his notice entirely. "This court will not tolerate such disrespect," he declared, straightening his robes with an air of self-importance. "I'm imposing a fine of $250, payable to the clerk's office by the end of the day." The amount was steep, deliberately so, meant to teach what he perceived as a necessary lesson. Several gasps echoed through the courtroom. The defense attorney and prosecutor exchanged uncomfortable glances, both recognizing the inappropriate nature of the judge's reaction, but hesitant to intervene. The court officer shifted his weight from one foot to another, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding before him. Sarah finally raised her hand, the simple gesture carrying years of professional authority. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear. The judge's expression shifted from anger to annoyance at what he assumed would be an excuse or plea for leniency. He had no idea that in the next few moments, his entire worldview was about to be challenged, and his authority questioned in ways he never expected. "Your Honor, I'm Sarah Johnson, the jury forewoman. I'm also a partner at Reynolds, Mitchell & Associates, specializing in corporate law." Her voice carried through the suddenly silent courtroom. The color drained from Judge Harrison's face as the implications of her words sank in. The transformation in the courtroom was immediate and electric. Other jurors sat up straighter, some even smiling slightly at the judge's obvious discomfort. The attorneys exchanged knowing looks. They had recognized her name from various high-profile cases, but protocol had prevented them from revealing this during the trial. Judge Harrison's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water. His earlier confidence evaporated as he realized he had just publicly berated and fined a highly respected member of the legal community. The courtroom deputy, who had seen countless dramas unfold in this room, couldn't hide his small smile. "The red line experienced technical difficulties this morning," Sarah continued, her voice remaining professional and measured. "I have documentation from the CTA, and I called the court clerk when I realized I would be late. I believe she left a message for you, Your Honor." The court clerk, Miss Thompson, nervously cleared her throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Ms. Johnson did call at 8:47 a.m. to notify us of the transit delay. I placed the note on your bench." She pointed to a small yellow sticky note that had gone unnoticed in the judge's haste to assert his authority. The whispers started at the back of the courtroom and rippled forward. Several observers who had been half asleep moments before were now fully engaged, watching the scene unfold like a live theater production. A young law intern in the gallery was frantically taking notes. This was the kind of courtroom drama they didn't teach in law school. Judge Harrison's face had now turned from pale to red, not from anger this time, but from embarrassment. His earlier assumptions and biases lay exposed, naked under the fluorescent lights of justice. The weight of his error pressed down on him like a physical force, made worse by the presence of dozens of witnesses to his prejudiced behavior. The next few minutes in courtroom 403 became a masterclass in professional dignity. Judge Harrison, now visibly struggling to maintain his composure, cleared his throat several times before speaking. "Ms. Johnson, that is to say, the court offers its sincere apologies for the misunderstanding." But Sarah knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. The entire courthouse was buzzing by lunchtime. Court officers, lawyers, and clerks whispered in hallways and elevators about how Judge Harrison had revealed his prejudices in spectacular fashion. The story spread through the building like wildfire, each retelling adding new details to the morning's events. Local reporters, who regularly haunted the courthouse corridors looking for interesting stories, caught wind of the incident. By afternoon, several had already requested comments from the court's public relations office. The court administrator's phone rang constantly as news outlets sought details about the confrontation between the judge and the prominent attorney serving as jury forewoman. Judge Harrison spent his lunch break in his chambers, door firmly closed, blinds drawn. His clerk reported hearing him make several heated phone calls, presumably to damage control specialists, and possibly his own attorney. The gravity of his actions weighed heavily as he realized this incident could severely impact his reputation and possibly his career. Sarah, meanwhile, received quiet words of support from everyone she encountered. The court reporter stopped her in the hallway to express her admiration for how gracefully she had handled the situation. Even the normally stone-faced bailiff gave her a respectful nod when she returned from the lunch break. The afternoon session began with Judge Harrison making a formal, public apology. His words seemed carefully chosen, likely crafted with the help of the court's public relations team. "The court deeply regrets this morning's incident," he stated, his voice carrying none of its earlier arrogance. "The fine is rescinded, and the record will reflect that Ms. Johnson's tardiness was both explained and excused. But the damage was done." In the gallery, law students furiously scribbled notes, recognizing that they were witnessing a significant moment in the ongoing conversation about racial bias in the justice system. The incident would likely appear in legal blogs and possibly even law school ethics discussions before the week was out. The incident in courtroom 403 became a turning point for the Cook County court system. Within weeks, Chief Judge Marcus Thompson announced mandatory bias training for all courthouse personnel, from judges down to security officers. Sarah Johnson's experience had exposed an uncomfortable truth about how deeply prejudices could run, even in the halls of justice. Local law schools began using the incident as a case study in their ethics classes. Professor Maria Rodriguez from Northwestern Law School incorporated it into her curriculum, telling her students, "This is what happens when we let our assumptions cloud our judgment in the legal profession." Students debated the various layers of bias displayed that day, from the initial reaction to Sarah's appearance to the judge's automatic assumption of disrespect. Sarah herself became an unexpected symbol of change. Law firms across Chicago invited her to speak about her experience. She shared her story not with anger, but with hope for improvement. "What happened to me wasn't unique," she would say. "What was unique was that I was in a position to challenge it openly." The Chicago Bar Association asked Sarah to lead a committee on judicial reform. She worked with other attorneys to develop new guidelines for courtroom conduct and bias prevention. Her calm handling of the situation had turned a moment of discrimination into an opportunity for systemic change. Judge Harrison's transformation was perhaps the most surprising outcome. Initially defensive, he eventually became an advocate for change himself. At a judicial conference 6 months later, he spoke openly about his actions that day. "I thought I was above bias," he admitted to his colleagues. "That morning showed me how wrong I was, and how much work we all still have to do." The story made its way through legal circles nationwide, sparking similar conversations in courthouses across the country. Other jurisdictions began examining their own practices and procedures, looking for ways to prevent similar incidents of bias from occurring. 1 year later, Sarah stood at a podium in the courthouse's main hall, now as the keynote speaker for their annual Legal Ethics Symposium. Looking out at the sea of faces, judges, attorneys, law students, and court staff, she smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most uncomfortable moments. The incident that could have been just another example of bias had instead become a catalyst for real change in the legal system.